You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey there, I'm Travis Hoyam, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Hidden Gems Investing. Each weekday on Motley Fool Hidden Gems Investing, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we game plan personal finance strategies and dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights and a long-term perspective on investing and, of course, stock ideas, plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
In the name of economy, you can commit a lot of sins, and also do a lot of good things. Don't you think so?
When you look at it, it's just a clean, typed memorandum, crowded over with handwriting. The handwriter made no attempt to dodge the typed words. The handwriting is all over the memo. And of course, the handwriting's from a president. And this document, it's not a famous document. I would say it's lightly infamous from people who study the history of the period. It was hidden for years. But it also played an interesting role in a presidential scandal. And it's a key, perhaps, to interpreting the history of the 1970s. And so you'll know that the president I'm talking about is President Nixon. And on this memo, which has been dubbed the Zilch memo, he writes all over his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. K. We've had 10 years of total control of the air over Laos and Vietnam. The result equals Zilch. There's something wrong with the strategy or the Air Force. This is something only recently discovered by reporter Bob Woodward, who had covered Nixon, obviously, during the Watergate years, and had written a book in 2017 where he interviewed Alexander Butterfield, the number 2 in the chief of staff's office, so he was right under Haldeman. And day to day, Butterfield did a lot of the basic work. I mean, to the point that Nixon had a buzzer, and when he buzzed, Butterfield had to come in and see what he wanted. And Butterfield grew to develop a resentment for Nixon. And it wasn't because of his politics per se, but it was this one memo and other evidence that he'd seen that, according to Butterfield, Nixon knew the bombing wasn't working. The day before, Nixon writes this handwriting on the memo. Bob Woodward notes that Nixon had been in an hour-long interview with Dan Rather of CBS News and indicated that the bombing had been very, very effective. Woodward said that the claim was a lie, and here Nixon made clear he knew it. And in his book, The Last of the President's Men, he cites various evidence that Nixon intensified the bombing anyway for a simple reason. It advanced his re-election prospects every time he bombed. Now, there's something telling that Woodward says about the Nixon tapes. Nixon was using the power of the presidency as an instrument of personal revenge and reward. If you listen to enough of the tapes, what's surprising is the dog that never barks. It's not what's said on the tapes, so some of it's shocking. How things are said is shocking. It's what's never said is what Woodward insisted. No one ever says what would be good for the country. What does the country need? Instead, it's all about Nixon. It's about getting somebody, screwing somebody, getting the IRS on somebody, getting the FBI on somebody. And it was also about Nixon's re-election. Now, I have a counter to this.
Thinking small. This is the interesting thing. Magruder he's been out in the apartments, and he comes back and he says, God, those people think small. So then you say, what do we do about traffic safety? Well, how do we cut down the death on the highways? What R&D? And he says they bring you stuff like the design of stop signs. He says, oh, I don't want that. He says, I want them thinking about anti-collision devices.
You don't even think small, but you know it's an interesting thing. Another way to put it, John, is that very few think big. Governors think small.
Yeah.
You know, we get out those governors in their mind.
I do believe some of the tapes have to do with running the country in a normal way.
They have announced that it's not one thing I want to do is discuss with you. My trip there on October 14th.
I I do believe that any White House is going, the president is a political figure in any White House, is going to mix politics with its deliberations and discussions.
Did you happen to raise, or did McGovern think that you know that what McGovern said you said isn't true? When he says ceasefire, he means ceasefire to be the American and to the Vietnamese. And then not a ceasefire, it means no ceasefire for Laos, no ceasefire for Cambodia, no ceasefire for South Vietnam. Stop bombing the supply lines, and they won't fire on our troops. Yeah. It's our way of selling out, of course.
I can recall hearing, Reagan during his presidency. I remember him insisting all the time that, politics does not enter our decisions. He had his pollster Worthman right there in the White House in many key decisions. So it just simply isn't true for any White House. Clinton would be talking politics and mixing it with policy until 2 a.m. It's just not a bifurcated process. So
McCora were over yesterday and laid it out. They're for them. They want to let them drill. And everything they say is right in terms of the administration of their responsibilities, offshore oil, and jobs.
What does it mean, revenue job?
Well, nobody knows, really.
No.
Nobody really knows. It amounts to a cash flow of $85,000 a day into the economy of the area. And it involves letting existing lessees drill 2 more wells beside 3 or 4 existing wells that they have in each of the localities. California has declared a moratorium on all drilling on their leases in the Santa Barbara Channel. We have declared a moratorium, a 2-year freeze, on all drilling every place except in these 2 leases. And the Department of Interior made its proposal to allow this drilling. The LA Times came out with a headline that big and said, more Santa Barbara drilling. And it is a very hot issue locally. So Whitaker first rang the bell on them and said, stop, we want to take a look at this. And I just don't know how to gauge the politics. I've talked to Finch, and he's doing more checking.
Having given you all of that counter, I still come down on, this White House, Nixon's, was particularly concerned with the things Woodward is talking about. A 1972 top-secret memo, the Zilch memo, scrawled in his own hand. We've had 10 years of total control. The result, Zilch. It confirms the senselessness of the war, but it calls into question the fact that Nixon continued his strategy, bombing in the region, even when he knew it wasn't the most effective policy. Now, Woodward considers this as bad or worse than Watergate. Watergate was sabotage, espionage, anything to win re-election. There is not a more corrupt use of power that I can imagine, using the war he inherited from Lyndon Johnson for the purpose of re-election. Some of this, too, is passing history and time and what we think of Vietnam now as opposed to in the past. But in the time, in contemporary times,
to say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
It would be a scandal. When you talk with Nixon, a scandal, it's like piling on. It would be a scandal upon a scandal for that memo to get out, because it would be a scandal to be doing anything else but ending the war in Vietnam, given the approval ratings of that war at the time. And if you're bombing or escalating, this, of course, was widely unpopular. Part of the reason for Kent State is the invasion of Cambodia, which included bombing. Widely unpopular by the point of Nixon's presidency. But when he does it, he's shoring up support with a certain type of crowd that he thinks is going to help him win election. Okay, it's not just like for the general approval rating, but with a certain type of conservative voter that he wants. Let's talk a bit about bombing. The bombing campaign that Nixon inherited, so that's important to say, inherited from Lyndon Johnson, who was using bombing. Of course, we weren't just going to have the infantry go in there without bombing first. He expanded it into Laos and Cambodia, arguing correctly that these countries were being used as staging areas, as to bring supplies in. It wasn't a matter of a few aircraft striking isolated targets. It was massive, carefully orchestrated. It had waves of U.S. Air Force and Navy aircraft flying bases from Thailand, South Vietnam, Guam sometimes, aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Long lines of fighters, attack aircraft, and heavy bombers crossed into enemy territory under radio silence or tightly controlled communications. Depending on what their mission was, they would drop thousands of pounds of conventional high-explosive bombs, sometimes fragmentation bombs, designed to shower steel fragments across wide areas. Delayed fuse bombs meant to collapse tunnels and bunkers. Napalm, or cluster munitions that scattered hundreds of smaller bomblets over fields, roads, and suspected troop concentrations. The centerpiece of what was doing the bombing was the B-52 Stratofortress. It is an enormous 8-engine bomber capable of carrying roughly 30 tons of bombs. Flying at altitudes around 30,000 feet, its crews often never saw individual soldiers or buildings below. But navigators aimed at coordinates calculated from reconnaissance aircraft. A 3-aircraft B-52 cell could blanket an area several thousand feet long, turning jungles, villages, or suspected military positions into overlapping craters. Fighter bombers such as the F-4 Phantom and the A-7 Corsair followed with more precise strikes against bridges, trucks, anti-aircraft guns, supply depots, and reconnaissance aircraft will go in to photograph the damage afterward. Hundreds of people were involved in these bombing efforts. Intelligence analysts sifted through aerial photographs, signals intercepts, reports from South Vietnamese units on the ground, and our allies at this time, and information from spies. In major operations, especially the 1972 campaigns, Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2, the White House itself, with Nixon and Henry Kissinger, sometimes reviewed and approved the target lists. This is from Foreign Policy in Focus. If anyone knows the B-52, it's the people of Hanoi. The enormous planes bombed them day and night for 12 days at Christmas in 1972. Today, there's a museum there dedicated to this bomber and what it's like to experience a bombing from below. The wreckage of one still sits in a small lake in the middle of the city. There's an article in the archives of a newspaper that describes a visit by Telford Taylor. Now, who is Telford Taylor and why he's in Hanoi while it's being bombed? It's because he is a Nuremberg judge. He's one of the judges at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. He comes along with folk singer Joan Baez and 2 other U.S. citizens in 1972. Why? These are people that the North Vietnamese are going to be more likely to trust. And they've shot down one of these planes. Guys, it's summer. Let's go shopping at Quince. Every summer, I like to do something a little different. I like to get a new polo shirt. I'm not getting a whole new wardrobe, but a new polo shirt. This year, it's the solid, deep navy flow knit breeze performance polo. It's cool, it's comfortable, and it's from Quince. They also have Heather Ocean Navy, Olive, True Black, and then there's Heather Dewstone Blue. Lighter blue. Personally, I like that with like a brown slack or a dark gray slacks. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They work directly with ethical factories and cut out the middlemen. So you're paying for exceptional quality. You're not paying for brand markup. I like my FlowNet polo. I think you'll like what you purchased too. Make your summer wardrobe easier. Go to quince.com/myhist for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/myhist, MYHIST, for free shipping and 365 days returns. Quince.com/myhist. And so this group goes to Hanoi at Christmas to deliver mail to pilots of the captured B-52s. But what happens is they expect that there'll be like a Christmas truce or something. That doesn't happen. Hanoi is bombed during this period. The visitors describe their fear in the midst of cataclysmic destruction and the subsequent journey through the city and its ruins. The most horrible scene that I've ever seen in my life was when we visited the residential area of Can Thu. And as far as I could see, everything was destroyed. The whole thing, the airplane was designed large because it was designed to drop nuclear bombs on the Soviet Union if that was ever needed. But what it's actually done is carry conventional bombs, releasing them over people and homes in dozens of countries. It's of course, the aim is not to bomb civilians, but if you're bombing roads, you're bombing various supplies. These are things that people use for their daily lives every day. Let's get back to the memorandum about this bombing. It's significant because it was never written to be public. It wasn't written to be in a memoir in the future. It wasn't written for political allies. It's a working piece of government. It's a candid annotation on a classified document intended for Kissinger's eyes only. This is the kind of thing that history places a lot of weight on, right? This is a president instructing their subordinate. Now, we don't just have this Zilch memo. I mean, for somebody like Butterfield, this thing is who was in the Air Force. This thing was serious. He had buddies who had died in Vietnam, been captured in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam. And to hear that we were just fighting for nothing, that the president was just willy-nilly on a policy, does it make him want to go in and tell on the president over Watergate? No. In fact, Butterfield did everything he could to avoid, short of lying, which he wouldn't do. He did everything that he could do to avoid answering questions about Watergate. But he was asked the question about the taping system. He did know, and he becomes the first witness to reveal that Nixon had a taping system. And that really sealed Nixon's fate, among other things. Now, he says that he was ordered to testify, so he had to do a deposition. He had Democratic and Republican counsel that they asked about the tape eventually. And he said he experienced some relief in getting the question and answered honestly. Now, how much of that was based on his very low opinion of Nixon's character, even though he was serving in the White House, we don't know. But he talks about in his book that this was one thing that made him very angry. It's not just the Zilch memo, though. There's been a study by University of Virginia Miller Center historian Ken Hughes. He wrote a book called Fatal Politics, the Nixon tapes, the Vietnam War, and the Casualties of Re-election. Now, he analyzes the tape. So most people look at the Nixon tapes are looking at it for fragments of Watergate. Hughes looks at it for Vietnam and concludes that Nixon privately understood bombing alone would not force North Vietnam to surrender, even as he continued to present the strategy as successful. He based the conclusion not on Butterfield's memo, because he actually hadn't seen the Zilch memo, but on Nixon tapes, CIA assessment, defense intelligence reports, Pentagon memorandum. So every time Nixon's on TV saying the bombing's working, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency are telling him it's not. The records suggest the bombing inflicted damage but was unlikely to achieve its stated strategic objectives, and it carried significant political value. Not because bombing's popular, but presidential toughness was, at least what the voters Nixon had to get. 72. Now, what is that challenge in 1972? Let's talk politics for a second. Nixon's a Republican. He's running. The Democrats are, partially due to some things that were engineered by some of Nixon's people, we now know, George McGovern is the nominee. What Nixon's going to want is to pull away some Democratic voters who are more conservative than George McGovern. They're not going to get the real lefty radical types. Those people are going to vote for McGovern. So therefore, when you look at the group that's left available for Nixon, he's viewing that showing some toughness is in his advantage. There is some polling data, particularly among Republicans, that show that the bombing's popular because the people aren't aware that Nixon has just written a message saying they amount to zilch. And so that's it, a brief note. There is one other thing to say here. Even with the evidence in his own hand of the zilch, saying these bombings equal zilch, there's a couple things to say in contrary that are possible. Three things, perhaps. One is we could be reading too much. Nixon says a lot of things. We could be dealing with a person who has a very high opinion of what the effectiveness should be, and his zilch doesn't mean it's doing nothing. Okay, that's one thing to look at. A second thing would be that it may have been effective for troops on the ground who like going into an area after it's been bombed versus not. So even if militarily overall it's not effective, the psychological experience of the average soldier going into an area or helicopter having to fly into a cleared landing zone, after it's been bombed versus getting shot at, you have to consider that point of view of the people on the ground. It would really take more studies of like soldiers' accounts and things like that than to just read one memo. That's one argument. And then the third point to make is that, and he would make this point, that he was forcing North Vietnam to the bargaining table by bombing. The point against that is from the North Vietnamese records, which, at least in one set of records, they indicate this bombing never stopped them from getting supplies in any great manner, and that they had about 2 years that they could continue to sustain even with this bombing at the rate it was going, that they could probably go another 2 years and bring the Vietnam War into 1975, which when you take the total North Vietnamese military operation, they were still active against South Vietnam at that time. So it makes all the sense in the world to still be active against the United States if we hadn't signed an agreement. So that's it. It's not a new document. It's interesting. Zilch memo isn't like tip of everyone's tongue when they talk about Nixon. But it's from 2017. It's an interesting part of history now, I suppose.